You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Tammany Hall, often known by other names such as the Society of St. Tammany or the Columbian Order, was established in 1786 and officially came into being on May 12, 1789, as the Tammany Society. It quickly became the Democratic Party's powerhouse in New York City and state politics, playing a pivotal role especially from the mid-19th century. Tammany Hall was well known for supporting immigrants, with the Irish receiving significant attention and assistance from the 1850s through the 1960s. Following Fernando Wood's mayoral win in 1854, for over a century, Tammany effectively controlled Democratic nominations and political jobs in Manhattan, with a major shift happening in the 1850s, when Irish Catholics became the majority of its supporters due to mass immigration caused by the Irish famine. The organization's influence expanded as it won the trust of the city's burgeoning immigrant community, making them a crucial political base. The business sector valued Tammany for its ability to simplify government regulations and foster economic growth for a reasonable fee. By 1872, Tammany was led by an Irish Catholic boss, and by 1928, a Tammany standout, Governor Al Smith of New York, secured the Democratic nomination for president. Despite its successes, Tammany Hall was also synonymous with political corruption, notably under the leadership of William M. Boss Tweed in the mid-19th century. In the 1880s, Tammany began appealing to the ethnic middle class through local clubs, securing a solid base of supporters. Leaders like Charles Murphy and Big Tim Sullivan worked to rebrand Tammany as a champion of the working class in the early 20th century, which helped deflect criticism and attract middle-class ethnic voters. This image overhaul helped people like Robert F. Wagner reach the U.S. Senate, and Al Smith serve 4 terms as governor and secure the Democratic presidential nomination in 1928. However, the 1930s and early 1940s saw Tammany's influence decline, especially after losing a power struggle with Franklin D. Roosevelt and the election of Fiorello LaGuardia as mayor, who opposed Tammany. Though there was a brief resurgence in the 1950s under Carmine DeSapio, opposition from figures like Eleanor Roosevelt led to Tammany Hall's power diminishing, and by the mid-1960s, Tammany Hall had all but disappeared. It's also worth noting that despite modern perspectives, Tammany Hall faced criticism in the 19th century for fostering nativism, anti-Catholic sentiment, and the rise of the Know-Nothing Party due to fears over its influence and tactics. The Tammany Society, which we now recognize, began in New York on May 12, 1789. It wasn't the first of its kind. The trend started in Philadelphia back in 1772. This club was initially formed for what they termed pure American. The name Tammany itself is a nod to Tamanend, a respected Native American leader of the Lenape people. The society really embraced Native American culture, from using indigenous words to adopting their customs, even calling their meeting place a wigwam. Now, the very first leader, or grand sachem of the society, was a guy named William Mooney, who made a living as an upholsterer on Nassau Street. Despite Mooney being the initial leader, it was actually John Pintard, a wealthy merchant and philanthropist who laid down the foundational rules with a constitution. He envisioned it as a political entity with a firm Republican core, aimed at balancing out the city's aristocracy with its democratic values. Pintard was also the brain behind using Native American titles for positions within the society. In those days, the society had the political support of the Clinton family. Meanwhile, the Schuyler family threw their weight behind the Hamiltonian Federalists, and the Livingstons eventually backed the Anti-Federalists, allying with the society. One of the society's notable actions was helping the federal government secure a peace treaty with the Creek Indians in Georgia and Florida in 1790, following a request from George Washington. They also welcomed Edmond Charles Genet, an envoy from the French First Republic after the French Revolution brought down the traditional monarchy in 1793. By 1798, the society's focus had pivoted significantly towards politics. Aaron Burr, a key figure in the Democratic-Republican camp, saw an opportunity with Tammany Hall to go toe-to-toe with Alexander Hamilton's Cincinnati Society. Tammany soon became the epicenter of Democratic-Republican politics in New York City. Burr leveraged Tammany Hall during the 1800 election campaign, where he served as the Democratic-Republican campaign manager. Some experts think that if it weren't for Tammany's influence, President John Adams might have clinched New York State's electoral votes and secured his re-election. In the early 1800s, a rivalry between local politician DeWitt Clinton and Tammany Hall, a political group, shed light on early cases of political corruption. This clash began in 1802 when Clinton accused Aaron Burr of betraying the Democratic-Republican Party, sparking a feud fueled by personal jealousies and ambitions within their political circle. Matthew L. Davis, a businessman, newspaper editor, and influential member of Tammany Hall, was one of Burr's closest associates. Despite Tammany's initial support for Burr, public outrage over Burr's fatal duel with Alexander Hamilton led to a shift away from him. By 1803, Clinton had become mayor of New York City and started favoring his allies with government jobs, a practice known as the spoils system. Despite Tammany Hall's efforts, Clinton's influence grew, overwhelming their control over New York politics, especially after Burr's popularity waned. Matthew Davis played a pivotal role in transforming Tammany Hall into a more structured political machine after 1805. Under his guidance, Tammany Hall became officially recognized as a charitable organization and set up a committee to influence leadership within the Democratic-Republican Party in New York City. During a political struggle with the powerful Livingston family, Clinton sought Tammany's support by promising to reconcile with Aaron Burr, but he never intended to keep that promise. When Tammany discovered Clinton's deceit, their brief alliance ended. Tammany Hall's efforts to control New York politics faced major obstacles, including public pushback that led to investigations into corruption and embezzlement among its officials. Despite such scandals, Tammany Hall tried to improve its image and finances through public relations stunts, such as promising to re-enter the remains of Revolutionary War soldiers and erect a monument in their memory, a promise they did not fulfill. The story of Tammany Hall during this period is a tale of political maneuvering, broken promises, and corruption, ultimately leading to a shift in political power in New York City as public opinion and internal dynamics within the Democratic-Republican Party shifted against them. Between 1809 and 1810, the tension between Tammany Hall and the Clintonites really started heating up, as both sides didn't hold back in attacking one another. James Cheatham, a Clinton supporter, didn't shy away from calling out Tammany for corruption through his writings, which he published in the American Citizen newspaper while holding the role of state printer. Tammany Hall, feeling targeted, pushed back hard and got Cheatham kicked out of his job. Meanwhile, Clinton tried to work with Tammany Hall, aiming for a Democratic-Republican-dominated state. He even went so far as to withdraw his support for Cheatham, his former protege, trying to win over the Tammany leaders. This backstabbing move infuriated Cheatham, leading him to spill the beans on the secret collaboration between Tammany and Clinton to take over the state. Unfortunately, Cheatham's fight ended tragically when he died after an attack on September 18, 1810, which some suspect was orchestrated by Tammany. From 1809 to 1815, Tammany Hall bounced back by welcoming immigrants with open arms and secretly establishing a new meeting place, or wigwam, for the appointment of new leaders, known as sachems. Decisions on these new leaders now rested with the Democratic-Republican Committee, composed of influential local Democratic Republicans. When DeWitt Clinton threw his hat in the ring for the presidency in 1811, Tammany Hall wasted no time labeling Clinton a traitor to his party and accusing him of trying to establish a family-run hierarchy. Even though Clinton won the support of New York State the next year, the Democratic Republicans couldn't shake off the suspicions Tammany had cast on him, leading many in New York City to distance themselves from Clinton. Tammany Hall seized the moment to support the War of 1812 and the Embargo Act, pulling war supporters into its fold. This moment marked a surge in Tammany's power, attracting even Federalists who were pro-war to its side. During and after the War of 1812, Tammany ditched its use of Native American titles in response to Native American attacks on white Americans. This period also showcased Tammany Hall's knack for drawing supporters from rival camps and rewarding its new members, a tactic particularly aimed at the Federalists who joined the organization. Tammany Hall, a political powerhouse, secured its dominance by diminishing DeWitt Clinton and his supporters to a minor group. By 1815, John Ferguson from Tammany Hall outran Clinton to become the mayor. Yet Clinton's role in the Erie Canal's success boosted his popularity so much that, despite previous setbacks and Tammany's strong efforts, he was elected governor of New York again in 1817. Clinton's favorable stance towards immigrants also played a big part in his resurgence. Originally, Tammany Hall targeted primarily Native Americans, sidelining groups like the Irish and Germans, with Germans being less involved politically. This exclusion sparked a significant riot on April 24, 1817, during a Tammany session. Clinton remained the governor, apart from a 2-year hiatus in 1823 to 1824, until his death in 1828, during which period Tammany's influence waned. Under Martin Van Buren and the Albany Regency, Tammany Hall's strategy evolved, advocating for a state referendum that in 1821 extended voting rights to all free white men in New York State, bolstering Tammany's political strength. The organization began including Irish immigrants, eventually relying on them heavily for political support. In the 1828 presidential election, Tammany leaders endorsed Andrew Jackson after he promised to give them control over some federal job allocations, a promise he kept once elected. By 1829, Tammany had become the Democratic Party's city affiliate, controlling many New York City elections thereafter. The 1830s saw the rise of the Loco Focos, a Democratic faction favoring labor rights and opposing monopolies, challenging Tammany by courting the working men's vote. Despite this, the Whigs remained Tammany's chief political foes. During the 1834 mayoral election, the city's first mayoral race decided by popular vote, Tammany and the Whigs aggressively vied for votes, even resorting to paying for votes, a practice Tammany continued in subsequent elections. The ward boss role within Tammany Hall was crucial for mobilizing votes and distributing jobs and favors. New York City's political landscape, divided into wards from 1686 to 1938, saw its governance evolve over time. With the introduction of the 1686 Dongan Charter, the city was segmented into 6 wards, mirroring the establishment of a common council responsible for electing the mayor, a system later enhanced in 1821 to give more power to the council, and further amended in 1834 to allow for the mayor's election via direct vote by the city's residents. Cornelius Van Wyck Lawrence, a Tammany-supported Democrat, made history in 1834 by being the first mayor elected through this direct vote system, marking a significant moment in New York City's political history. During the 1830s and 1840s, Tammany Hall, a New York City political organization, grew its influence significantly by gaining the support of the city's rapidly increasing number of immigrants. This strategy paid off especially during the 1840s, when many Irish fled to New York to escape the devastating famine back home. Tammany Hall's power surged as it built a strong electoral base with these new residents by offering them various forms of assistance in exchange for their votes. Before the establishment of formal public welfare systems in America, groups like Tammany Hall essentially filled that void, particularly for the immigrant communities. They provided essential services such as jobs, housing, and legal aid, significantly impacting the lives of those who had recently arrived in the country. For instance, George Washington Plunkett, a notable Tammany figure, once spent a day helping people in dire situations, from assisting the victims of a fire to preventing a family from being evicted and more, all in a day's work. By the mid-1850s, Irish immigrants made up a significant portion of New York City's voting population. This demographic shift allowed many Irish individuals to hold influential positions within Tammany Hall, further solidifying its control over city politics. Tammany Hall also played a crucial role in helping immigrants assimilate into American society, guiding them through processes like becoming naturalized citizens. Under the leadership of William M. Tweed, special naturalization committees were established to assist immigrants with the necessary paperwork and even cover the costs associated with becoming a citizen. This process often involved bribing city officials to overlook the irregularities, ensuring that the immigrants could vote, with the expectation that they would support Tammany Hall candidates. This strategy of mutual support between Tammany Hall and immigrants, particularly the Irish, established the organization as a dominant force in New York City politics. When Fernando Wood was elected mayor in 1854 with Tammany's backing, it marked the beginning of a long period during which Tammany Hall controlled the city's political scene, lasting until Fiorello LaGuardia's victory in 1933. After Fernando Wood's unsuccessful attempt to get re-elected to the U.S. Congress in 1842, he decided to step away from the political scene for a bit to focus on his shipping enterprise. During the 1840s, Tammany Hall found itself in a bit of a leaderless state, getting caught up in the chaos caused by various political gangs vying for control. These weren't your average gangs. We're talking about the Dead Rabbits, the Bowery Boys, Mike Walsh's Spartan Association, and several others, including Captain Isaiah Rinder's Empire Club. Rinders, a key figure in Tammany Hall, was rumored to be the guy pulling the strings behind all the gang-related political activities. It's interesting to note that many of these gang leaders ran their operations out of bars, which put them squarely in the sights of those pushing for prohibition and societal reform. When the 1850s rolled around, New York City's economy began to improve, and members of Tammany Hall started to see the financial benefits. The city council at this time gained a reputation for being exceptionally corrupt. In 1852, Tammany politicians took over the seats previously held by the Whig Party, forming a new council known colloquially as the 40 Thieves. This council was divided into two groups, each with 20 members, the Board of Aldermen and the Board of Assistant Aldermen. Their influence was vast, with the power to appoint police, license bars, grant access to streetcar and ferry routes, and even serve as judges in criminal courts. Despite their positions being officially unpaid, suspicious real estate transactions and charges of taking bribes for city contracts began to surface. Deals that raised eyebrows included the sale of land intended for a pauper's burial site, and prime city land going to associates of the aldermen under questionable circumstances. To make a bit of extra money, aldermen would sometimes introduce legislation that threatened businesses financially, only to kill the bills when those affected paid them off. However, as the media started exposing these underhanded tactics, a push for reform gained momentum. By June 1853, efforts to clean up the city's act led to significant changes in how contracts were awarded and how bribery was dealt with, aiming to ensure a fairer and more transparent system. Fernando Wood started out in the 1830s trying his hand at various small businesses in the city, while getting more involved with Tammany Hall, a political group. Although his early business ventures didn't take off, he didn't give up. By the time he was 24 in 1836, Wood had made a name for himself within the society of Tammany Hall, especially for how he managed to resolve a dispute between two factions within the hall, the Locofocos and the Conservatives. By 1840, when he was 28, Tammany Hall backed him for a U.S. congressional seat, and he won it. After serving in Congress, Wood turned his focus to real estate, found success, and was elected the mayor of New York City in 1854. William Tweed, a notable figure of the time, remarked about Wood's knack for real estate by saying, "I never yet went to get a corner lot that I didn't find Wood had got in ahead of me." While Mayor Wood didn't hesitate to shake things up, he made sure the police were attuned to his interests and convinced the commissioners he should have the power to fire any officers slacking off. However, he faced criticism for seemingly only hiring Democrats as replacements. In a bold move that went against the norms, Wood ran for a second term as mayor in 1856, causing a stir within Tammany Hall. His re-election campaign was aggressively supported by his police force, acting as his tough guys, and he even took a cut of their salaries for his campaign funds. On the day of the election, Wood's police got time off to vote, and his allies, the Dead Rabbits gang, kept an eye on the polling stations. Wood secured his second term as a result. The Republicans, gaining traction upstate, responded to Wood's concentration of power by creating a new state charter for New York City that called for more city officials to be elected rather than appointed. They also set up a new police force, the Metropolitan Police, by merging the forces from several counties, and changed the city mayoral elections to odd years, with the next one scheduled for December 1857. This led to a clash between Wood's municipal police and the new Metropolitan Police, as well as between the Dead Rabbits and the nativist Bowery Boys. Amid the chaos of the Panic of 1857 and a scandal involving Wood and his brother Benjamin, Tammany Hall chose not to support Wood's re-election in December 1857. In the wake of a major scandal in 1858, Fernando Wood broke away from Tammany Hall to create his own political faction, which was called the Mozart Hall Democracy, or just Mozart Hall for short. The name came from their headquarters located at the intersection of Broadway and Bleecker Street. With the support of James Gordon Bennett's New York Tribune, Wood threw his hat in the ring for the mayoral race of 1859. He positioned himself as the defender of working-class Irish and German immigrants, taking a stand against what he described as the kid-glove-scented silk-stocking, poodle-headed degenerate aristocracy. During this election, the Republicans tried to form an alliance with Tammany, but the plan fell through. This led to a three-way race for mayor, which Wood clinched with 38.3% of the vote, marking his second and final term, which lasted until 1862. Throughout the 1860s, Mozart Hall remained influential in New York City's political scene, even securing additional school wards for German communities. The Civil War period saw Democrats split into two camps: the War Democrats, who supported a Union victory, but criticized the radical legislative actions of Republicans and infringements on civil liberties by Abraham Lincoln, and the Peace Democrats, who preferred a return to the pre-war Union with slavery intact, or some even arguing for peace without reuniting the country. Within this divide, William M. Tweed, most of Tammany Hall, and several leading businessmen fell into the war group, while Mozart Hall became the hub for peace Democrats in New York. This division initially worked in Wood's favor in 1859, but by 1861 it contributed to the election of Republican George Opdyke as mayor over Wood and Tammany's candidate, C. Godfrey Gunther, with just over a third of the vote. Mozart Hall began to move closer to Tammany Hall after the Civil War, and saw its influence wane over time, eventually dissolving in 1867. Under Tweed's leadership, Tammany Hall's grip on New York City's politics became incredibly tight. Starting in 1858, Tweed cleverly used a position on the County Board of Supervisors, gained amidst efforts by Republican reformers to check the power of the Democratic city government. This role was just the beginning for him. It led to more appointments and allowed him to place his allies in key positions. From there, he climbed the ranks to become the Grand Sachem of Tammany Hall, effectively taking over the city's governance. Tweed's influence expanded further as his protégés secured the roles of New York's governor and the city's mayor, making it easier for his so-called ring to extend its corrupt activities across nearly every aspect of city and state governance. Despite being elected to the state senate, Tweed's real power came from the various city government appointments he held. These positions allowed him to tap into city funds and control public works, enriching himself and his associates, while also providing jobs for Irish immigrants who formed the core of Tammany's support base. Kenneth D. Ackerman, a biographer of Tweed, admired the sophistication of Tweed's system, describing it as an engineering marvel, adept at controlling crucial forces within the city: the courts, legislature, treasury, and even the ballot box. Ackerman highlighted the elaborate frauds and organizational skills that characterized Tweed's rule. During Tweed's tenure, New York saw significant growth and development. This included the beginnings of the Brooklyn Bridge, expansions into the Upper East and Upper West Sides, and the funding for institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as the construction of orphanages and almshouses. Through his control, Tweed and his associates amassed great wealth, while forming alliances with the city's wealthy elites, who either participated in or tolerated the corruption due to Tammany's control over the immigrant population. In 1871, events began unraveling for Tweed and his ring. James Watson, a county auditor with incriminating documents, died under suspicious circumstances. However, the attempts to destroy the evidence failed when a new auditor, connected to a former sheriff, leaked financial accounts to the press. The New York Times and Harper's Weekly cartoonist Thomas Nast played critical roles in exposing the corruption, notably after the Orange Riot of 1871, which signaled the beginning of Tweed's end. The public's outrage led to the formation of the Committee of 70, tasked with investigating Tweed's misdeeds. Tweed was arrested and tried in 1872 and died in Ludlow Street Jail in 1878. Following his fall, political reformers took control, marking a new era for New York City and state politics. Tammany survived but shifted, now relying on leaders of Irish descent, moving away from its previous Protestant-dominated leadership structure. After the downfall of Tweed, Tammany quickly got back on its feet. The organization knew it needed a significant cleanup, and they chose a new leader, former county sheriff known as Honest John Kelly. Kelly was clean. He hadn't been involved in the Tweed debacle, and he was deeply religious, even having family ties to Archbishop John McCloskey. He took action, sweeping out anyone connected to Tweed, and made sure he tightened his grip over the organization's structure. Kelly did such an excellent job getting the organization back on track that by the 1874 election, The Tammany-backed candidate, William H. Wickham, won over the less popular, reformist sitting mayor, William F. Havemeyer, who passed away not long after. This victory, along with wins across other races, meant that Tammany Hall was once again in charge of the city. There's even a famous statue of John Kelly inside the hall, created by the Irish artist Robert Cushing, highlighting his significant role in its history. In the 1886 mayoral election, an important change was stirring. The United Labor Party, born out of union activism, chose Henry George, a well-known political economist and author of Progress and Poverty, to be their candidate. George was initially unsure about running, but after Tammany Hall, the political powerhouse of the time, secretly offered him a congressional seat to bow out of the race, hoping to keep their grip on the title of working men's champions, he decided to run. This move forced Tammany to scramble for a strong contender. Tammany, under the leadership of Richard Croker, knew they needed both the Catholic Church and the middle-class Irish-American vote on their side. Croker also aimed to unify the different Democratic Party factions to stand against George's potential to reshape New York City's politics. They chose Abram Hewitt, a well-respected leader and philanthropist, Peter Cooper's son-in-law, as their Democratic candidate, while the Republicans nominated Theodore Roosevelt, a former state assemblyman. Abram Hewitt won the race, with Henry George coming in second, beating Roosevelt by about 2,000 votes, a sign of potential for the labor movement's future in politics. However, their political influence did not last. Tammany managed not only to survive but also to adapt some of the fresh campaign strategies introduced by the United Labor Party, making political meetings and rallies part of their new playbook. Croker introduced clubhouses and family-friendly events to improve Tammany's image and strengthen their political machine. Despite Hewitt's victory, he didn't align well with Croker, leading Tammany to support Hugh J. Grant in the next election, who became the first New York-born Irish-American mayor. Grant's administration allowed Croker almost free rein, setting up a sweeping patronage system that surpassed anything previously seen. Croker also worked to win back labor support by passing legislation that benefited workers, while keeping business interests happy with a laissez-faire approach and low taxes. Under Croker's lead, Tammany extended its influence to the state legislature, effectively controlling New York politics along with the Republican boss Thomas Platt, using a system of patronage and bribes that enveloped the state. In the 1890s, history seemed to repeat itself when it came to scrutinizing Tammany Hall, echoing inquiries that took place in the early 1870s. A central figure in organizing these investigations was Platt, who set up several committees, starting with the Facet Committee in 1890. During this initial investigation, there was a noteworthy moment when Croker's brother-in-law testified, shedding light on cash gifts related to his hotel business. Despite the revealing testimonies, no legal charges were made, and the Democratic Party didn't face any negative consequences in either the 1890 or 1892 elections. In 1894, Tammany Hall faced a major challenge, revealing public hearings on police misconduct instigated by the Lexow Committee, which was acting on evidence found by Reverend Charles Parkhurst during his undercover inspection of the city's seedier side, sparked a significant response. In reaction, the Council of Good Government Clubs formed the Committee of 70, including some of New York's wealthiest individuals like John Pierpont Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Abram Hewitt, and Elihu Root. Their aim was to break Tammany's powerful grip on the city. They supported millionaire businessman William Lafayette Strong for mayor, effectively pushing Tammany's initial choice, department store co-owner Nathan Strauss, out of the race by threatening his social standing in New York. Tammany then turned to Hugh Grant, a choice tainted by his association with the police corruption scandals. However, with significant financial backing and campaigning by the Committee of 70, alongside Grant's lackluster campaign efforts, Strong won the mayorship convincingly. He pledged to run the city on business principles, focusing on efficiency and moral integrity. That election also saw a Republican dominance statewide, with millionaire banker Levi Morton winning the governorship and the party taking control of the legislature. During this time, Richard Croker, a key Tammany figure, was notably absent, spending 3 years in Europe starting from the beginning of the Lexow Committee's investigations. Despite this setback, Tammany Hall made a comeback by the year 1898. Richard Croker returned from Europe, and capitalizing on the demise of Henry George, which dampened the momentum of the political labor movement, managed to realign the Democratic Party to garner labor support. This shift, combined with backlash against the reformers' efforts to impose strict moral standards, like banning Sunday alcohol sales, helped Tammany regain control. Their candidate, Robert Anderson Van Wyck, defeated the reform-backed Seth Low, marking Tammany's return to power. The victory was celebrated with supporters marching through the city streets, triumphantly proclaiming, "Well, well, well, reform has gone to hell." In 1899, at the suggestion of the newly elected Theodore Roosevelt, a final state investigation got underway. This probe, known as the Mazzei investigation, was led by Robert Mazzei, a Republican assemblyman, with Frank Moss serving as the chief counsel. Moss brought experience from his time on the Lexo Committee. During this investigation, new information came to light about Croker's business dealings. The inquiry also brought out memorable remarks from both the police chief William Stephen Devery and Crocker himself. Additionally, this investigation marked the first time questions were raised about Croker's involvement in ice companies. Despite facing some setbacks, Tammany Hall was a force that managed to hold its ground and even thrive. Under the guidance of leaders like Charles Francis Murphy and Timothy Sullivan, it kept a tight grip on the reins of Democratic politics, both in New York City and across the state. From 1898 to 1945, the political scene in New York City was a battleground between two groups, the political machines and the reformers. When things were calm, the political machines, backed by a solid base of supporters, usually had the upper hand. They controlled city affairs and had a significant influence on the state legislature in Albany. A prime example is Tammany Hall, which, starting in the 1880s, built a strong network of local clubs that drew in ambitious people from the middle class. However, during tough times like the major depressions of the 1890s and 1930s, the reformers managed to take over important positions, including the mayor's office. These reformers weren't a cohesive group. They worked through a web of independent civic reform groups, each pushing its own reform agenda. Their ranks were filled with educated middle-class professionals who were opposed to the corruption associated with political machines. The 1898 merger of Brooklyn, Western Queens County, and Staten Island with Manhattan and the Bronx gave these reform groups more clout, especially when they found a common cause to rally behind, like consolidation itself. Unlike a single citywide machine, separate Democratic machines thrived in each borough, with Tammany Hall in Manhattan being the most notable. These machines were well organized at the local level, with political clubs and a distinct leader or boss. For example, Charles Murphy quietly led Tammany Hall from 1902 to 1924, while Big Tim Sullivan was a key figure in the Bowery and represented the machine in the state legislature. Republican organizations were weaker but played a significant role in forming reform coalitions, often looking beyond the city to Albany and Washington, D.C. for their influence. Seth Low, once president of Columbia University, became a reform mayor in 1901, but lost support from the working class due to his association with the anti-liquor movement. Murphy, aiming to improve Tammany's reputation, backed reforms that helped the working class via his protégés, Governor Al Smith and Robert F. Wagner. Ed Flynn, another of Murphy's protégés, highlighted Murphy's advice against politicians getting involved with gambling, prostitution, the police department, or the school system. Tammany's dominance was challenged by William Randolph Hearst, a powerful newspaper publisher with political ambitions. Despite initially securing and then losing Tammany's backing in various elections, Hearst eventually returned to California after losing control over Tammany-supported Mayor John F. Hylan. After Charles Francis Murphy passed away in 1924, the control that Tammany Hall had over Democratic politics started to fade. George W. Olney took over as the new boss, notable for being the first to have a college education. Under Olney's leadership, especially after Jimmy Walker became the mayor in 1925, Tammany seemed set to regain its old power. However, Olney wasn't a domineering leader, and soon the hall reverted to its old ways of taking protection money from shopkeepers and exploiting markets and docks, with its middlemen benefiting from increased licensing fees. But this resurgence didn't last long. With the growth of other boroughs like Brooklyn and the Bronx, Manhattan, which was Tammany's stronghold, couldn't assert the same level of control. Franklin D. Roosevelt's election as the governor of New York in 1928 cut further into Tammany's influence. Al Smith played a key role in Roosevelt's political ascent, but once in office, Roosevelt distanced himself from Smith and instead appointed Edward J. Flynn, a decision which marked a shift away from Tammany's grip. The stock market crash of 1929 and heightened scrutiny of organized crime during the Prohibition era also contributed to Tammany's decline. In 1929, Olney stepped down, and John F. Curry was chosen as his successor, despite not being the favored or as capable a candidate as Eddie Ahern. Curry's tenure was marked by poor decision-making. A notable incident that year was the robbery of a city judge and Democratic club leader, Albert H. Vitale, at a dinner party, which led the public to demand a deeper investigation into the city's underworld connections. Vitale came under scrutiny for his unexplained wealth, and his removal from the bench was just the beginning of Tammany's troubles. Further investigations led by U.S. District Attorney Charles H. Tuttle revealed more corruption, including judges accepting bribes for business favors. Franklin D. Roosevelt launched 3 investigations between 1930 and 1932, led by Samuel Seabury, which would come to be known as the Seabury Commission. These investigations uncovered deep-seated corruption involving gambling, the judiciary, and law enforcement, leading to the dismissal of corrupt judges, the resignation of Mayor Jimmy Walker, and the indictment of several officials, including the arrest of State Senator John A. Hastings. Sheriff Thomas M. Farley was also removed from office by Governor Roosevelt, marking a significant blow to Tammany Hall's power and influence. In 1932, things took a difficult turn for the political group known as the Machine. Jimmy Walker, the mayor at that time, had to leave his position because of a scandal, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was focused on reforming, won the presidency. Leaders of Tammany Hall and the Brooklyn political scene had backed Al Smith for the presidency, but Roosevelt, together with his main campaign strategist James Farley, decided to redirect Tammany's federal support. This federal support was significant, as it had expanded considerably under the New Deal, and they instead gave it to Ed Flynn from the Bronx, who was recognized for running an efficient, corruption-free operation. Things became even more challenging for Tammany in 1933, when Roosevelt assisted Republican Fiorello LaGuardia in getting elected as mayor with a fusion party ticket, which further diminished Tammany's influence. Once in office, LaGuardia transformed the administration by staffing the city cabinet with individuals who were not affiliated with any party and prioritized cleaning up the government. In a surprising turn of events, when Tammany Alderman Alfred J. Williams passed away in December 1933, the Board of Aldermen unexpectedly chose a LaGuardia ally as his replacement in January 1934. This selection was so astonishing that Augustus Pierce, a Tammany leader from the Bronx, had a heart attack and died right in the aldermanic chamber. Under LaGuardia's leadership, a significant change occurred in 1936 with the adoption of a new city charter, which was ratified through a referendum. This charter introduced a more equitable method of electing city council members and ended the old ward system that had been in effect since 1686, completely overhauling the city's governmental system. LaGuardia filled many long-term positions with his appointees, greatly reducing Tammany Hall's control. Furthermore, LaGuardia increased the portion of city jobs requiring the passing of a civil service examination from about 50% in 1933 to approximately 75% by 1939. He made history by being the first reform-focused mayor to be re-elected, achieving victory in 1937 and once again in 1941, each win further diminishing Tammany's influence on the city. Tammany Hall's influence had traditionally depended on controlling government contracts, jobs, and the electoral process through corruption and patronage. However, their ability to influence voters and maintain loyalty declined after 1940 as relief programs like the WPA and CCC, which had helped them gather support, started to fade. Christopher "Christy" Sullivan was among the last of the Tammany bosses before the organization's power finally faded away. Throughout the 19th century, Tammany Hall had strong connections with street gangs. These gangs helped Tammy during elections, and in return, Tammany protected them legally for the rest of the year. This partnership ended when Prohibition led to the rise of new crime organizations. Tammany then had to rely on figures like Arnold Rothstein to try to keep some control over these groups. Unfortunately, when Rothstein was murdered in 1928, Tammany's influence weakened significantly. This contributed to Fiorello LaGuardia being elected mayor in 1933, and Thomas E. Dewey being appointed as a special prosecutor by Governor Herbert H. Lehman in 1935. Dewey was determined in his fight against crime. In 1936, he managed to convict Lucky Luciano, a key ally of Tammany, on racketeering charges, with Luciano receiving a sentence of 30 to 50 years. Even though Luciano continued to lead his crime family from prison until he was deported to Italy in 1946, his conviction bolstered Dewey's efforts to tackle organized crime and its connections to Tammany Hall. In 1939, Dewey, who had become Manhattan District Attorney, charged Jimmy Hines, a major Tammany Hall figure, with bribery. Hines was convicted and sentenced to 4 to 8 years in prison. This was a heavy blow to Tammany, as Hines had established strong connections between the political organization and the city's crime figures since the 1920s. Dewey also successfully prosecuted several other Tammany officials linked to Hines and Luciano. In a notable case in 1943, District Attorney Frank Hogan revealed a recorded phone conversation between Frank Costello, a gangster, and Judge Thomas A. Aurelio, a Tammany associate. Aurelio was heard pledging his loyalty to Costello. Although Aurelio kept his job and even won re-election, the scandal led to Michael Kennedy resigning from his Tammany position in January 1944 after Costello admitted to using his influence to get Kennedy and Aurelio their positions. Tammany's influence continued under Costello's guidance, helping William O'Dwyer become mayor in 1945. O'Dwyer was re-elected in 1949 but resigned in 1950 amid a bribery scandal that also implicated Costello. This scandal led to the resignations of hundreds of police officers involved in protecting illegal gambling operations and resulted in a complete overhaul of the New York City Police Department's plainclothes division. The Kefauver hearings, which investigated organized crime, didn't directly harm Tammany Hall's operations, but did tarnish its image because of its supposed links to criminal activities. In a notable moment, when former mayor and then ambassador to Mexico, O'Dwyer was called back in 1951 to speak about a bribery scandal. He struggled to clear his name, especially when questioned about a problematic visit to mobster Costello's apartment back in 1941, a visit that was part of his efforts to win Tammany's backing for his mayoral campaign. O'Dwyer's career took a further hit when he resigned as ambassador in 1952, after a close associate of his was found guilty of accepting bribes. Despite these challenges, Tammany saw a brief resurgence in the early 1950s under Carmine DeSapio. DeSapio, positioning himself as a reformer and openly sharing his political strategies, managed to get Robert F. Wagner Jr. elected as mayor in 1953 and W. Averill Harriman as governor in 1954. This success also marked a shift in Tammany's ethnic leadership from Irish American to include other backgrounds, including DeSapio's Italian heritage. However, DeSapio's connections with Frank Costello, a prominent mobster, tainted his reformist image and confirmed the criminal associations of the leadership. By 1956, Costello's influence began to wane, especially after a tax evasion conviction and a subsequent prison term. His power struggles within the mob, particularly with Vito Genovese, and a failed assassination attempt ultimately led him to step down from leading the Luciano family in 1957. DeSapio's political influence suffered a significant blow in 1958 after his candidate for the Senate, Frank Hogan, lost the election. This defeat, coupled with the election of Republicans Kenneth Keating as senator and Nelson Rockefeller as governor, exposed DeSapio as a traditional Tammany Hall boss, undermining his previous reformist stance. By 1961, the political landscape had shifted, with Mayor Wagner securing re-election through a campaign that distanced him from DeSapio and Tammany's machine politics. The post-World War II era saw the rise of a new generation keen on political reform, exemplified by the establishment of the Lexington Democratic Club by young veterans and Democrats who felt sidelined by Tammany's old guard. This push for change gained momentum with Eleanor Roosevelt, Herbert H. Lehman, and Thomas K. Finlitter's efforts through the New York Committee for Democratic Voters, leading to DeSapio's ousting in 1961. The decline of Tammany Hall was swift thereafter. By 1967, the organization had lost all political significance, a downfall cemented when the Village Independent Democrats, led by Ed Koch, took control of the Manhattan Democratic Party, marking the end of Tammany Hall's dominance in New York politics. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.